So I want to talk a little bit about the data model that I used to create this application. And to showcase different columns, I made it a little more complicated and to showcase what that might look like. So the first object that we need to look at is this thing called post. And I think it's helpful to keep post as a struct um, because it just seems to work easier and with parts of SwiftUI. But what is key is this struct has an object which is a protocol. It's some kind of some kind of thing that conforms to the Pokemon protocol. And this is to allow different kinds of Pokemon. And so let me talk about each one of these things sort of one at a time. And I know there's a lot here, so just hopefully it'll help connect some dots. So the first thing is since this post is what's used everywhere in the app and it's displayed, it needs to be identifiable. And if you remember, identifiable is that you need that to work with list. Because the list needs a unique identifier to find each item in the list of things. And so in order to be identifiable, that's this var ID. And I use UUID, which is generated by Apple, and we create an instance of it actually. This automatically generates some random identifier for us. And by giving it a default value, I don't have to think about it. I just write this once, and whenever I create posts, it always gets a random unique identifier. Now, if you're connected to a server or something like that, and you got these from a server, this UUID would actually be generated from the server, and that would look different. But for all the applications that we're writing and so far in this class, this is a great approach to do that. The next is the Pokemon, which is, the really meat of this. The post doesn't really do much, but the Pokemon is really where all the data is. It has the image and the name and all these things, and we'll look at that in a second. But for now, we'll come back to that. And then is favorite, just that's to handle that star toggling on and off. And I decided that, the favorite really is part of the post. It's not necessarily part of the Pokemon. But depending on your actual use case, you could decide where you might put something like this. So we have identifiable and ID is handling that, but we also have hashable. And we need hashable to do that selected post. That sort of programmatic navigation needs it to be hashable. I'm not going to get into all the details of what the heck hashable means and is this, potato hash or whatever, like hash browns? No. But it's a computer science thing, and it has to do with breaking down an object, and it's kind of similar to identifiable, but it also has this idea of equatable. So when you do hashable, they also make sure that you decide how does one thing equate to another. And to conform to this protocol, you have to conform to this function. And this is the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And it's just saying if you have two posts, how do we know if they're equal or not? And in this case, in our case, it's quite simple. It's just whether their ID is the same or not. And that's all you need. Now, you could imagine, though, maybe in a different use case, you might want to say, what actually makes this different is if the Pokemon, like ID or, Pokedex ID is equal to the right-hand side Pokedex ID. Maybe you'd want some other way to compare these things in a complicated data model. And so this would be valid to decide if they are equatable. And the other part of it, so that's quite, is this hash. And so you put these things inside of the hasher, and that is, it's a mathematic thing to decide whether these things are equals. Basically, you want this and this to match. So if it's just ID, if we get rid of this, then that's fine. That's a good approach. We're saying that this is how they're equatable, and this is how they mathematically compile into an integer together. But if we did say, no, I really want to know which the Pokedex ID so that I don't know if you have multiple Bulbasaurs, I want them to equal each other so that I know those posts are all the same. I'm not sure why you would do that, but let's say you want to do that. Well, if you add this, then you would also want to add hasher combine, and you would say Pokemon Pokedex ID, something like that. So the point being that this equatable and this hasher should match. Now, in our case, we don't want that. That would probably mess up how the logic, because we want each post, the post should be unique, even if you have multiple Bulbasaur or something like that, because it's a post of the thing, and maybe there's 1,000 people that each post Bulbasaur, right? So this would not be the logic that we want. So we will get rid of that. And so this is a good implementation. And then the other thing that I did, and this is just for convenience, but sometimes there's some little logic that you need to like present your strings or labels and stuff like that. And you can do this in the view, but I find it's a little bit cleaner and nicer to just do it in the model here. And this is sort of, in some paradigms, people might call this the view model. In some paradigms, they call it the presenter. There's a little overlap and debate on the terminology. But in this case, it kind of works to just have it inside the struct itself. And so you can use computer variables. And for example, the Pokemon display name, right? You saw Bulbasaur, but there's also like Erica's Bulbasaur or Pikachu and Ash's Pikachu. So, and you can imagine in your post, you might have a variation on your names depending on the data available. And so what I'm saying is, okay, if there is an owner, then I want the display name to have the owner's name, right? But then, and add parentheses S and this sort of thing to make it look nice. But if there is no owner, so this owner is an optional, it's another optional, then we just will use the Pokemon name. And like in our subtitle, where we're displaying the Pokedex ID, I can go ahead and add this Pokedex colon sort of thing. And it's just nice to have it here. It helps the views be a little cleaner. But again, there are multiple ways to do this. Finally, the Pokemon image name, same idea, where the way that I've named my images in order for it to work, I either go based off the owner or I go on the Pokedex ID. And this way I know that my image will always be correct. So those are just some convenience things. All right. Now let's talk about the Pokemon protocol and structs. So in this case, I have struct Bulbasaur, Charmander, Squirtle, Pikachu, and then our one protocol Pokemon. Now, I would say probably in most cases, you don't need to do this. This is demonstrating a more complicated model. And so I wanted to show you this earlier, but I am sorry if that caused confusion for the homework. I saw some trying to use protocols, and that's fine, that's good, but you just don't need to. Like for the homework, it's so simple that, I mean, the data model is simple. You don't actually need protocols, but in a more complicated setup, you might. And the reason is, in this case, the way the Pokemon game works, you have this type of Pikachu, but you could have many individual kinds of Pikachu. And so it's helpful to group it all together as a protocol. But as you saw, we just have like our posts or something, and if we're using something simple, we might just have this be a struct, and we might like not have these at all or something like that. But let me show you another example of why you might do it this way. Let's say we're not doing a Pokemon app, but we are doing like an Instagram app or something like that. And what we want to know is we want to have some kind of media, right? We want some kind of media that's going to be displayed, okay? And we'll say it has name, type, whatever, but it has, right? But then there might be different kinds of media. And so one might be like Instagram stories or something. And this would conform to media. Oops. Another one might be GIFs or something, This is also media. And maybe we have, video, media, and maybe we have image, right? So like in Instagram, you can, right, post things as an image, as a video, and then, Instagram story is maybe a special kind of video format. I don't know. There could be some variation. Yes, I don't know if you'd exactly do it like this, but the point is there are different kinds of media. And so what's nice about using a protocol, right, is we have one protocol thing and we can have many different types of media and that could grow and change. But what's cool is way here at the top, whatever we're displaying, as long as this is media, it just works because it can be, right, and this will be media or something. And it could be video, it could be Instagram story, it could be whatever it needs to be. And that's much easier than having to say, oh, we have a var video that's type video, and we have an image that's type image, and, Insta story that's type Instagram story. You can see this would get really complex and really convoluted really quickly. And often, a post is only going to have one of those things, it's not going to have each of these. And you'd have to use like optionals because maybe it has one, maybe it doesn't. And it just becomes a mess. And so this is where like protocols are really helpful to just say, hey, I don't care what kind of media it is. I just know when I post a thing, it's gonna have some kind of media. And then in the protocol, we can figure out those different kinds. And so that's what the Pokemon is showing, these different types, which is different than like the individual, right? There's a difference between the general type of Pokemon, which is like the video content or the Instagram story content. And that's different than saying like Erica's Bulbasaur or, this specific Bulbasaur, which would be like this specific video or that specific image. Uh, and then that's how you instruct your thing. So protocols are good when it's this general type that would then have specific types of their own, not instant, right? So these are still types. These are not instances. And maybe that wasn't clear before, but I just sort of want to reemphasize that. So now that I have thoroughly like broken all of this stuff, let me just put it back together. All right, now we have Bulbasaur. It's also a Pokemon, and this guy needs to be Pokemon. And so it would be Pokemon, right? And the one thing, there's certain time when you're describing a protocol in this way, we add any, which is to say, this is a specific type, right? Like at the end of the day, this variable, it's either a Bulbasaur or a Squirtle, right? It's either a Instagram story or an image or video. It's never just a generic media thing, right? This is never just a generic Pokemon. It's always a specific Pokemon. And so we put that any in front of the type. And so we have fixed all the bugs or removed the ones that we created. And so that's that. Just a little bit on data models. Hopefully that's helpful. But I understand if there's still questions, please feel free to ask. This is very much like learning spoken or written language, right? It just takes time to connect all the grammar and connect all the concepts before you can finally actually use them in conversation and in sentences. But I hope this is helpful, and I will see you online.